In the autumn of 1934, a man could lose a farm his family had worked for 3 generations and walk away with nothing in his hands but what fit in his pockets. And in those years, a working man's pockets held a great deal. A pocket was a toolbox and a tackle box. It was a kitchen drawer and a doctor's bag. And on a dark road, when a stranger fell into step beside you a little too close, it was the last thing standing between a man and whatever the night had in mind. These were not the weapons of soldiers. What you are about to see are ordinary objects: a sliver of stone, a curl of rawhide, a folding blade worn thin as paper, carried by people who had almost nothing and meant to keep what little was left. Some were tools that turned dangerous only when they had to. A few were never anything but quiet trouble, slipped into a bib pocket and prayed over. Before we begin the countdown, 2 of these are worth waiting for. Number 2 was a thing the lawmen of the day feared more than a loaded pistol because it left no wound to find and made no sound to hear. And number 1 is so plain, so cheap, and so completely forgotten that you have almost certainly held one without ever knowing what it once meant to the man who carried it. If stories of how hard those years truly were are the kind of thing you came for, take a second now and subscribe, because this is exactly that kind of story. We begin at number 28. Number 28. The pocket whetstone. Nothing else in the pocket worked until this one did. Before a blade could be trusted to cut clean, and a blade that did not cut clean was the dangerous kind, the kind that slipped, it had to be brought back to an edge. And that began with a flat sliver of Arkansas novaculite, the pale, fine-grained stone quarried out of the Ouachita Mountains and sold for a few cents at any hardware counter. A man kept his in the bib of his overalls, worn into a shallow trough down the middle from 1,000 passes. On a Sunday, with the fields resting, he would wet it, lay the steel against it at the angle his hands had long since memorized, and draw slow circles until the blade would shave the hair off his forearm. The stone put no holes in anybody. It simply made every other thing in his pocket twice as serious. Number 27. The plug tobacco knife. Half the grown men in the country chewed or smoked a twist of dark tobacco, and the little folding plug knife was made for one job. It shaved a clean cut off a brick of it without dulling the good blade a man used for everything else. It was small enough to lose in a watch pocket, with a short, sturdy blade, and usually a worn bone handle gone amber with sweat. There is nothing fearsome about it, and that is rather the point. Most of what a man carried was like this: humble, specific, and aimed at getting through an ordinary day a few cents cheaper. The plug knife cost a nickel and asked nothing of anybody. Number 26. The sacking needle. On a farm that fed itself, almost everything came and went in cloth bags, feed and seed and flour and ground corn, and a torn sack was money running out on the ground. So a man kept a sacking needle, a heavy curved spike of steel 3 or 4 inches long with an eye punched near the point for stitching those bags shut with twine in a few quick passes. It rode in the bib beside the knife, and like the saddler's tools, it spent its whole life mending the small things that held a place together. It cost a penny or 2 from the same store that sold the sacks. A careful family never threw a bent one away. They straightened it by lamplight and used it another 10 years. Number 25. The cobbler's knife. In good times, you took your boots to a shoemaker. In the years after 1929, you fixed them yourself or you went without, and so a curved cobbler's knife found its way into a great many pockets and toolboxes. Its short, hooked blade was ground to skive leather thin, trim a worn sole, and cut a patch from an old boot to save a newer one. It was the whole quiet religion of make, do, and mend that kept a family shod. Through a decade when a new pair of shoes was a luxury a lot of children simply did without. This was a tool of patience, not violence, and few men would ever have thought to raise it against another. But it was wickedly sharp by necessity, because leather does not forgive a dull edge, and that is the thread running through nearly everything in this story. The same keenness that made a tool useful made it, in the wrong moment, into something else. Number 24. the fish hooks and the snare line. A paper of hooks and a coil of waxed line weighed almost nothing and could mean the difference between meat and want. Most farmers ran trot lines on the creek and set that same line between two saplings as a snare for rabbit and squirrel, and a man who could read a game trail never went truly hungry. The hooks themselves were guarded like coins. A rusted one was straightened and resharpened rather than tossed away. Out on the rails, the hobos who crisscrossed the country looking for work learned to beg or barter for them, because a single hook could feed a man for a week. But mostly this was about supper. In the worst of the Dust Bowl, when the crops blew away and the money simply vanished, that little packet of steel was survival folded into a shirt pocket. Number 23. The hoof knife. The whole country still ran on horsepower, the four-legged kind, and a lame mule in the middle of plowing season could put a family a year behind. So every man who kept a horse or a mule carried a hoof knife, its short blade hooked at the tip for digging out a stone or paring rot from the tender. Frog of the hoof. It lived in the bib pocket, close to hand, its little leather sheath worn shiny against the denim. It was simply always there, riding from sunup to dark like a part of him. A blacksmith would sell you one for about 15 cents. In a world where a man's mobility, his crop, and his cash all walked on four hooves, this small curved blade was as essential as the boots on his feet. Number 22. The corn husking peg. Before the mechanical picker came to the corn belt, the harvest was pulled off the stalk one ear at a time, by hand, by the thousands. And the tool that made it possible was the husking peg, a short hook or spike of steel strapped across the palm or lashed to a glove. With it, a good husker could rip the shucks back and snap the ear free in a single motion, working down a row faster than the eye could follow, all day until his hands had cramped into the shape of the hook. Whole counties held husking contests, and a champion was a local hero. It was the most honest kind of labor, and the peg itself was nobody's idea of a weapon. The peg cost a dime and wore out a pair of gloves a season. Number 21. The frog gig. On warm nights when the bullfrogs started up along the creek, a man slipped a three-pronged gig into his pocket and went hunting protein in the dark. Lashed to a cane pole at the water's edge, those barbed iron tines speared frogs and fish with a quick downward jab, and a mess of frog legs fried in lard was a feast in a year when the smokehouse hung empty. Off the pole, the head rode easy in a pocket with its points wrapped in a rag, and children learned to gig long before they were trusted with a gun. A gig head cost a dime at the feed store. In the hungry years, it put cheap meat on the table on nights when there was nothing else to put there at all. Number 20. The folding pruning saw. The orchard men and the woodlot farmers carried a folding pruning saw that opened like a giant jackknife. Its curved blade raked to bite through green limbs on the pull stroke. It shaped apple trees, cleared fence lines, and bucked stove wood far from the barn, chewing through a branch with a sound like tearing cloth. Folded shut, it disappeared into a deep pocket and rode forgotten until a limb needed taking. A man almost never thought of it as anything but a tool, and honestly, it made a clumsy weapon. The good ones, stamped from Sheffield steel, cost about $50 and were touched up with a special triangular file by lamplight. In a country where most of a man's heat and most of his fences came out of his own two hands, a saw like that was wealth, folded small. Number 19. The quirt. Coiled like a sleeping snake, the braided rawhide quirt hung from a saddle horn or a man's wrist, built to turn a stubborn mule or move cattle through a gate. It ended in a short leather popper that cracked like a pistol shot and could raise a welt straight through a flannel shirt. The good ones were braided by hand over long winter evenings, strand over soaked strand, and the secret of a quirt lived in its handle, where a few ounces of lead shot were woven down inside for balance. Flicked one way, that hidden weight stung an animal into minding. Swung the other way, the loaded butt of the handle became a short, brutal club. It cost $1 from a saddle maker, or nothing at all from a patient pair of hands and a winter's worth of evenings. Number 18. The belt hatchet. Small enough to ride in a deep coat pocket or hang from a loop, the belt hatchet split kindling, drove fence staples, and helped with the hog killing come November. Its short handle and heavy head delivered a blow far past its size, and a man kept the bit bright enough to shave a curl off a pine board. It was the most honest tool he owned, in a way, because nobody ever mistook a hatchet for anything gentle. There was no pretending. The hobos riding the rails carried them too, for firewood at the camps they called jungles. A good head from Plum or Kelly, the big American axe makers, cost about $50 and was handed down like an heirloom. Through the lean years it built, it mended, and it fed a family. And on a dark night, the simple weight of it in a man's fist was comfort enough. Number 17, the corn knife. Closer to a short machete than a pocket tool, the full-length corn knife was too long for any pocket. But the men who cut fodder by hand all carried one, and many kept a folding cousin in the overalls besides. The big blade hung from the belt during harvest, heavy enough to lop a cornstalk in a single swing and keen enough to shave. Through the long days of cutting and shocking corn, a man's whole world could narrow to the rhythm of that blade rising and falling. It was the nearest thing most farmers owned to a sword, and they handled it with the easy respect of long use. A corn knife cost 2 bits at the hardware store and was reground on the grindstone every season. In hard country, the line between a harvest tool and a weapon was only ever a question of which way a man chose to swing. Number 16, the hawkbill knife. Folded, the hawkbill was a fat little package. Open, it showed a blade curved like an eagle's talon, ground sharp along the inside of the hook. It was built to cut on the pull, through binder twine, through a seed sack, through a coil of rope in one smooth draw, and that inward curve meant it caught whatever it touched and dragged the edge deeper the harder you pulled. Tobacco men used them to prime leaf. Haymen sliced baling wire with them. It rode in the watch pocket, came open with a thumbnail, and snapped shut against a thigh. Folks respected the hawkbill because it did one thing with frightening efficiency. It cut on the pull the way nothing else in the pocket did, and a man learned fast to keep his other hand clear of the path. It cost $0.25 at the general store. Number 15, the skinning knife. When a deer hung from the barn rafters or a fox came in off the trap line, the skinning knife went to work. A short, fat, upswept blade ground to slip between hide and flesh without nicking the meat. Its edge curved so it peeled rather than cut. It rode in a leather sheath inside the overalls, and a trapper in the depth of the depression might run 40 sets before dawn, because the pelts he took with that blade brought hard cash when absolutely nothing else did. A good fox hide fetched real money in 1933, and fur was one of the few things a man could still turn into dollars in a winter when the banks themselves had failed. The knife stayed wickedly sharp from constant stropping. It cost about 40 cents. For a family living on fur and game, this was the tool that turned the woods into a paycheck. Number 14, the fixed blade sheath knife. Where the folders ruled the pocket, the fixed blade sheath knife rode the belt for the heavier work. 5 solid inches of carbon steel with no hinge to fail at the wrong moment. Hunters, trappers, and the men who worked far from the house trusted it for everything from splitting kindling to dressing a deer, and its full tang let it pry and chop and, yes, stab where a folding knife would have closed on a man's own fingers. The sheath was often homemade, cut and stitched from a scrap of harness, and it hung at the hip or tucked into the waistband of the overalls. There was no polite pretending with this one. A sheath knife was frankly built to be relied on when things went wrong, miles from any help. A good one cost about 75 cents, a real outlay in those years. On a lonely road or in a dark barn, the steady weight of it was the difference between worry and calm. Number 13, the stockman knife. If the cheap Barlow was a farmer's everyday hand, the 3-bladed stockman was his Sunday best, a handsome folder carrying a big clip blade, a flat sheep foot, and a stubby spay blade, each ground for a different chore. The clip dressed game and whittled. The sheep foot cut rope, clean against a board without rolling into the wood. and the spade was made for the very stockwork that gave the pattern its name. A man kept all three honed and oiled, and opened and shut them by the fire out of pure habit, the way other men worried a coin. It cost a whole $1, a serious sum, so a stockman was often a gift, the knife a father pressed on a boy when the boy was judged old enough for a man's work. The bone handles wore smooth and amber over the years. Number 12. The catalog knife, from Case, Remington, and Winchester. Not every knife came from a dime store. By the 1920s and 1930s, a handful of American names had become objects of real longing in the farm supply. Catalogs that arrived in every rural mailbox. W.R. Case and Sons of Bradford, Pennsylvania, built stockmans and trappers good enough to hand down for generations. Remington, far better known for its rifles, stamped out enormous numbers of pocket knives in those years. And its celebrated bullet knives, marked with a little bullet shield set into the handle and first made back in the early 1920s, are among the most sought-after folding knives this country has ever produced. Winchester put its name on knives too, right up until the Second World War. These were the blades a man saved for, or received once in a lifetime, and carried with a quiet pride a Barlow never quite earned. A fine one might run $2 or $3. It is worth remembering, when you see those names on a collector's table today, that they began their lives as the hard-won treasures of people who had very little else. Number 11. The straight razor. Every grown man shaved with a straight razor, stropping it to a singing edge on a leather belt each morning, and that same beautiful edge made it one of the most dangerous things a person could fold into a pocket. Tucked into its bone or celluloid scales, the razor looked like nothing, a gentleman's grooming tool, which is exactly why it traveled where other blades drew suspicion and got a man turned away. On the rails and in the hobo camps, it earned a dark reputation, since a man who snapped one open settled a dispute faster than anyone wanted. On the farm, it was simply part of being respectable, a clean-shaven face for church and the trip to town. The finest blades, forged in Sheffield in England or Solingen in Germany, cost $1 or more and lasted 50 years, and a careful man kept his wrapped in oilcloth against the rust. Honed until it parted a hair without effort, the straight razor carried civilization and menace in the very same small handle. Number 10. The watch chain and fob. A man's pocket watch was often the single finest thing he owned, and he wore it on a chain, an Albert, the catalogs called it, looped across the bib of his overalls and anchored to a buttonhole, sometimes with a small folding fob knife hung on the end. The watch told him when to be in the field and when to be at the depot. But the chain did something else, and the old-timers knew it. A heavy watch on a foot of steel chain, swung hard, made a quick and ugly improvised weapon when a man's hands were otherwise empty. It is a small, strange detail of those years, that the proudest and most respectable object a working man carried could, in a desperate 10 seconds, become the thing that got him home. But the knowledge rode there alongside the time, the way so much knowledge did in that generation, quiet and unspoken and ready. Number 9. The slingshot. Here is the one nearly every farm boy in America made with his own 2 hands. A forked branch of dogwood or hickory, 2 strips of red rubber cut from a ruined inner tube, and a pouch from the tongue of a worn-out shoe, that was a slingshot, and in practiced hands it was no toy. A boy who practiced from sunup could knock a sparrow off a wire, take a rabbit for the pot, or drive a hawk off the henhouse from 40 feet. Best of all, the ammunition was free, just creek pebbles, stray ball bearings, or the soft lead a family melted down round over the kitchen stove from old St. Sinkers and spent shot. It cost nothing but an afternoon to make. Silent, accurate, and endlessly reloadable, the humble slingshot put meat in the pot and ran off trouble without ever spending one precious shotgun shell. Number 8. The slungshot, not to be confused with the slingshot, and the names have tangled people up for a century. The slungshot was a sailor's weapon that drifted inland. A heavy weight on the end of a short cord or a braided handle, swung to deliver a single stunning blow. Farmers and hobos made their own from whatever lay close. a round river stone or a lead sinker sewn into a leather pouch, a length of sash cord, a knot to grip, and coiled in a pocket it looked like nothing but a bit of harmless rope. A flick of the wrist sent the weight out hard and fast, and unlike a club, it vanished again in an instant. In the rail yards it was so feared that towns wrote it into their ordinances by name and banned it outright. It cost nothing and took 10 minutes to make by lamplight. Quiet, deniable, and brutally effective, it was the great equalizer of men who owned almost nothing else in the world. Number 7. The brass knuckles. Now we come to the kind of thing nobody mentioned in church. Brass knuckles, or far more often a homemade set poured from melted scrap by a man who could not spare the money for the store-bought article, turned a bare fist into a hammer. They rode flat and hidden in a bib pocket, weighing almost nothing, drawing no eye at all until the moment they were wanted. In a decade when desperate men rode the rails and a farm could sit miles from the nearest sheriff, a working man sometimes wanted something that worked up close and quiet. No powder, no report, no telltale blade left behind. You could order a set through the mail for a quarter, or make one for nothing. They are flatly illegal across much of the country today, and they were frowned on even then. But to a man with almost nothing, they were one more piece of hard insurance, kept close and prayed over in the hope of never having to use it. Number 6. The cane sword. Here things turn almost genteel. A sword cane looked like an ordinary walking stick, and plenty of older farmers and country preachers leaned on one going to town, but a twist of the handle drew a slim blade hidden down the shaft. These canes filtered down to the countryside, through estate sales and the back pages of mail-order catalogs, and a man who had wrecked a knee in the fields found one served two purposes at once. He could walk to church on it, and if the road turned dangerous after dark, he had a yard of steel that nobody suspected. The blade was thin but wickedly pointed, made for a single quick thrust. A decent sword cane cost a few dollars, real money, so carrying one quietly marked a man of some standing. Most who owned one never drew the blade in their lives, but the secret of it went with them everywhere, hidden in plain sight in the crook of an arm. Number 5. The hideout pistol, the derringer, small enough to vanish in a closed fist. The derringer was the hideout gun of choice for anyone who wanted protection without the bulge of a holster. The name itself is a piece of American history, and a misspelling. The original was the work of Henry Derringer, a Philadelphia gunsmith born in 1786, who took the new percussion cap of his day and built around it a short, big-bore pocket pistol, usually in a Hev 41 caliber, useless at distance but formidable across a card table or in a dark doorway. He never patented it, and the copies came so thick and so fast that the misspelled word, Derringer, with 2 R's, became the name for the whole breed. After his death, Remington carried the idea on with its little over-under double Derringer in 41 rimfire, a 2-shot pocket gun still being made well into the 1930s, which is exactly why so many of them turned up, worn and oiled, in the overalls of the Depression. Tucked into a bib, a boot top, or a flour sack under the wagon seat, it was quiet insurance for a man driving the egg money to market down a lonely road. Number 4. The My Friend Knuckle Duster. Of all the odd little guns that ended up in a farmer's pocket, none was stranger than the one a man named James Reed called, with grim affection, my friend. Reed was born in Belfast in 1827 and had worked as a machinist in the cotton mills of Glasgow before he emigrated to America and, in 1864, moved his family up to the village of Catskill, New York, by most accounts for the mountain air, hoping to help an ailing daughter. There he built a revolver with no barrel at all. He did it to sidestep a patent a larger competitor held on the bored-through cylinder, and he argued in court that a barrel-less cluster of chambers was not legally a revolver but a pepper box. And he won. The result was a solid little fistful of brass or iron, chambered in 22, 32, or 41 rimfire, with a ring-shaped hole through the grip so that, once it was empty, the heavy frame became a set of knuckles in the hand. Some 23,000 were made, and they stayed in pockets for half a century. A gun that was also a fist. There was no more honest expression of those years than that. Number 3. The owl head revolver. By the 1930s, the most common pistol in rural America was not some gleaming Colt. It was the cheap top-break revolver folks called the owl head, after the owl stamped into its grips, the workhorse of Ivor Johnson's Arms and Cycle Works, a New England company that, fittingly enough, also built bicycles. Sold for $1 or $2 and turned out by the million, the owl head found its way into nearly every farmhouse drawer and a great many overall pockets. Chambered for the humble 22 or 32, it was no match for a charging bull, but it ended snakes, put down injured stock, and warned off two-legged trouble just fine. Ivor Johnson built something genuinely clever into them, too. A safety its own engineer, Andrew Furberg, patented back in 1896, which kept the hammer off the cartridge, unless the trigger was truly pulled. So, a dropped gun would not go off. That is the safety the company advertised, when it told customers they could hammer the hammer all they liked. These guns had a darker side to their fame. It was a .32 caliber owl head that an assassin used to kill President McKinley in 1901. But for a poor man, the owl head was the great equalizer, real protection that even a sharecropper could afford. Number 2. The leather sap. The lawmen of the 1930s feared this one more than a loaded pistol, and they had good reason. The leather sap, the blackjack, left no wound to find and made no sound to carry across a quiet farmyard at night. It was a flat strap of leather, sewn around a flexible spring steel spine, with a slug of lead worked into the head. It fit the palm, rode flat and invisible in a hip pocket, and one short swing put a man on the ground without a cut, without a shot, without a sound. The police carried them. So did the men the police chased. In the hard years they passed through the pawn shops and the mail order pages for about $1, and a man who could not spare $1 stitched his own from a scrap of harness leather and a fishing weight. A careful farmer kept one by the door, or in his overalls, when strangers came through for the harvest. Of everything in this whole catalog of quiet trouble, the sap was the most personal protection that asked no powder and told no tales. Number 1. The Barlow knife. And finally, in first place, the one tool no farmer was ever truly without, and the one almost nobody remembers now. The Barlow is older than the country itself. It was first made around 1670 in Sheffield, England, by a cutler named Obadiah Barlow, who built it to be tough, plain, and cheap. 2 blades, a slab of bone, and one long iron bolster to take the abuse. Obadiah's family carried the design across the Atlantic, and an American named John Russell, at his Green River works in Massachusetts, made it the everyman's knife of a whole continent. George Washington is said to have carried one as a boy, and Mark Twain fixed it in the American memory forever in Tom Sawyer, where a brand new Barlow worth 12.5 cents sends the boy into a fit of pure joy. For a single dime, it gave a working man everything. It cut twine and whittled pegs, peeled apples and gutted fish, trimmed harness and cleaned fingernails and dressed a rabbit, all in a day. A boy's first Barlow was his first step toward being a man, and he carried it until the blades wore down to slivers from a lifetime of sharpening. It rode in the right-hand pocket of nearly every pair of overalls in America, warm from the body, open 10,000 times a year. And when the day turned mean, when a drifter crowded too close, or a dog showed its teeth, that same humble blade, snapped open with a practiced thumb, was oldest and the truest defense a working man owned. It built this country quietly, and it still rides in a few pockets today. 28 forgotten things, and every one of them tells a story far larger than any single blade or weight or worn bone handle. They are the evidence of a generation that trusted its own 2 hands, that could turn a dime's worth of steel into a tool, a meal, and a measure of safety all at once, and that carried the hard knowledge of how to do it quietly, without complaint, into the worst years this country has ever known. Most of these objects have slipped out of our pockets now, traded away for comforts our grandparents could not have dreamed of. But The resourcefulness they stood for is worth remembering, and so are the people who lived it. Which of these surprised you the most? Tell me down in the comments. And if your own grandfather carried one of these, a worn Barlow, an owl head in a drawer, a sap by the door that he never spoke about, I would truly love to hear the story.